We are entering into a new unit called macromolecules. The series of videos that will be coming up that I'll be assigning to you within the next couple weeks or so will each be describing a different macromolecule. Macromolecules are the molecules of life. Sometimes they're considered to be biomolecules. Either term is correct. I'll be using the term macromolecule in class. Macro meaning large, molecule meaning molecule. These are the molecules of life. There are four that we'll be discussing throughout this chapter, one of which is carbohydrates, which is what this video will be focusing on. Another group is called lipids, another group is proteins, and the last group is nucleic acids. As stated before, this video will be focusing on carbohydrates only, and there'll be a separate video for each group of macromolecules. So let's get started talking about carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are the sugars and the starches. Their function is to give short-term energy to the organism that is obtaining the carbohydrate. It's our main source of energy, but it's important to know that it's our short-term energy. It's the energy that our body will utilize first when going through any type of daily activity. The elements that make up carbohydrates is carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but it's important to know that it's only in a ratio of 1 to 2 to 1. So if you look at the example here at the bottom, we have a molecule of glucose, and the structure for glucose is C6H12O6. What that means is that there's 6 carbon atoms, that's what the C stands for. There are 12 hydrogen atoms, and there are 6 oxygen atoms. So this is the most basic example of a carbohydrate, because if you see here the ratio being 1 to 2 to 1, 1 carbon atom for every 2 hydrogen atoms for every 1 oxygen atom. So if you see here that the number of carbon atoms and the number of oxygen atoms will always be the same for the structure of any carbohydrate, and the amount of hydrogen atoms will always be doubled. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to be 6, 12, and 6 all the time. This can be doubled, and we could have C12, H24, and O12. There are 3 types of carbohydrates that we're going to be discussing. The first one is monosaccharides, the second is disaccharides, and the third is polysaccharides. Now, the word saccharide means sugar. The prefixes mean how many molecules of that sugar are being put together. So mono means 1. So your monosaccharides are going to be your simple sugars that only contain 1 sugar, or 1 molecule of that sugar. Disaccharides, di means 2, so therefore these are 2 monosaccharides bonded together in order to form a more complex sugar. And lastly, we have polysaccharide, poly meaning many. This would be 3 or more sugars put together in order to form an even more complex carbohydrate. Let's discuss more in detail of each type of saccharide. So we'll start off with the monosaccharides first. Again, mono meaning 1, saccharide meaning sugar. So we just like to call these our simple carbohydrates or our simple sugars. The formula for monosaccharides will always be C6H12O6. That is the simplest formula that you can have for a monosaccharide. And the term that we've been using so far in class that should be familiar to you now, the term monomer. I told you in class that the term monomer is a very general term that we can use for all the macromolecules. But each macromolecule has their own monomer, and monosaccharides are the monomer for carbohydrates. When you have different monosaccharides coming together to form larger, more complex carbohydrates. That's what monomers are. They're the building blocks to form polymers. So the monosaccharides are the monomers of carbohydrates. The three most common examples of monosaccharides is glucose, galactose, and fructose. Notice that they all have similar structure, but they are different. They're different in their structure, but the amount of carbon and hydrogen and oxygen is all the same. It's where they're arranged, where the elements are arranged, is what makes them structurally different from each other. So as stated before, there are three different types of monosaccharides that will be the examples that we'll be using in class. Glucose is the most common. The reason being is because glucose is the product that's made in photosynthesis. And because that's the product that plants make, not only do they utilize that that energy for themselves, the energy that comes from the carbohydrate, from the glucose specifically for themselves, but when herbivores use that energy, they're harnessing that glucose and using it for themselves. And when omnivores, which are humans, animals, or organisms that can eat plants and they can also eat other organisms, they still utilize that same glucose that originally came from the plant. So glucose is the basis of all the energy that not only gets created in the plant itself during photosynthesis, but it gets carried throughout all the different trophic levels. Fructose, again, is a monosaccharide, but it's a little bit structurally different, and fructose is found in fruits. This is what makes fruit sugary. And galactose is the carbohydrate that's found in milk. Again, they're all monosaccharides. They all have the structure of C6H12O6, but they're all slightly different in terms of their structure and where they're found. The next form of carbohydrates that we're going to discuss is disaccharides. And as stated before, the prefix di means two. So when we have two monosaccharides, remember mono means one, so we have two monosaccharides coming together, we will form a disaccharide. Again, remembering the terms that we stated in class already, let's make it simple and use the word monomer and polymer. So if we have two monomers coming together, you would make a polymer, and that polymer would have two monomers inside of it. All we're doing now is we're just being specific, and we're talking specifically about carbohydrates. So instead of saying the term monomer, we're going to use the term monosaccharide, and instead of using the term polymer, we're going to use the term disaccharide when talking about a polymer that only contains two monomers inside of it. So here we have glucose, C6H12O6, right? This is our general formula for a monosaccharide. I'm just going to say it's glucose because glucose is a monosaccharide. So we have one monomer, but because they're carbohydrates, we're going to call them monosaccharides, plus one monosaccharide will yield, remember this yield sign means that there's a chemical reaction going on, one disaccharide. Now, if you notice over here, we are also saying that it's forming water. And the reason for that is because when we have monomers coming together to form a polymer, you are losing water. So water is technically considered to be a product. And this is what we call a dehydration synthesis reaction. So when you have monosaccharides bonding together to form a disaccharide, that is an example of a dehydration synthesis reaction. Some examples of disaccharides that you may be familiar with is lactose. Lactose is the disaccharide, so we call this a more complex sugar that would be found in milk products. Maltose, which is found in wheat products, and sucrose, which is the most common of the disaccharides, which is found in regular table sugar. Our third and final type of carbohydrates are called polysaccharides. Poly meaning many. In this case, we're specifically talking 3 or more. So when we have 3 or more monosaccharides bonding together through dehydration synthesis reaction, we will form polysaccharides. We also consider our polysaccharides to be our complex sugars, and that's just because there's more monosaccharides that make them up, therefore their structure becomes complex. The examples of polysaccharides that you would be familiar with would be starches and cellulose. Cellulose is found in plants and it gives plants that rigid feel to them. The best example that I could give you for cellulose would be to think of celery. If you've ever had celery before, you know that when you bite into it, it has that crunch to it. That's because celery has a lot of cellulose in it, and that's what the cell wall of plants are made up of. That's why the cell walls give the plant rigidity, and it gives it shape and it gives it structure, because cellulose is a complex carbohydrate, a polysaccharide. Starches, on the other hand, are typically found in the roots of plants. So as you see here, this potato is a modified root for plants, and what they do is during photosynthesis, when plants make glucose, they store that glucose, and all of those glucose molecules come together. Again, remember, glucose is a monosaccharide, and it will bond with the other glucose molecules to form these more complex starches. And the thing that's great about starch is that it's able to be used a lot longer than monosaccharides because it takes longer for the polysaccharide or the starches to break down. So it's almost used as a reserve energy source for plants whenever they don't get enough light or if they don't get enough water in order to make the glucose that they need from the photosynthesis. They can always use this stored energy that they have in their roots in the form of starch. So are there any indigestible carbohydrates? And cellulose is the #1 carbohydrate that humans cannot digest. Our body just doesn't, they don't have enough enzymes to break down cellulose. It's too complex of a carbohydrate. Like I said before, that cellulose is found in the cell wall of plants, and the more complex that plant is, the more cell walls there are, therefore the more cellulose there is, and it's a lot harder to break that down. So the foods that have cellulose would be bran, spinach, broccoli, celery, anything that has that crunch to it. And even though we can't digest it and we don't get any nutritional value from eating cellulose, it does aid in waste elimination. So what that means is as the cellulose passes through the digestive tract, anything that's left over in your intestines, because our bodies aren't absorbing the cellulose, it just passes through your digestive tract, it passes through your intestines, and what it does is almost scoops up the extra stuff that's kind of left in those intestines and pushes it along with it and allows for you to have a cleaner digestive tract. Glycogen is another form of a polysaccharide that's used for animal storage. So animals use glycogen and they actually store it in their muscle cells and their liver cells, and it's used for the storage of energy. So where can we find these polysaccharides in everyday life? Well, as stated before, cellulose is a plant-based complex carbohydrate, so you would find cellulose in any plant source. Animals store glycogen as their storage of energy in their muscle and their liver cells. And starch can be found as your more bready and wheaty types of plants. So obviously in this delicious mac and cheese, there is a ton of starch in that. There's starch in pasta, there's starch in bread, pizza, anything that has bread or wheat to it would have a lot of starch in it.